Back with another question from the monthly questions thread. This one's from Ben. Let's get into it. Hi Kieren, just wondering if you have any tips or videos on how to show you've jumped back in time without the use of a cliche 2 weeks later. Hi Ben, thanks for the question. This is a really good one and something that I think honestly I need to expand into a long form video for YouTube if I can factor that in at some point. I did make one a while back, a few years ago, which I'll link below. It is very old and at this point a little bit cringe, but it might be useful. For now though, here's a few quick suggestions of ways you could approach slipping back in time. We'll start with the basic one that you mentioned, the old 2 weeks earlier. Sometimes the right thing to do is just to keep things simple. In many cases, this would just work absolutely fine, either as a sort of chapter header or title, or as just part of a general sentence or a bit of narration. Simple can sometimes be better, especially if you're only going to do one considerable flashback in the story. But like you said, it can seem a little bit tired or perhaps not quite as exciting or creative as you might want. Or if you're going to go back and forth a lot, you need something a bit more low-key and smooth, perhaps. Another option is a transition of some kind, a way to extend a hand to the reader to help them cross the chasm between present and the past. If we think about how our own memories sometimes work, they're often triggered by something that we encounter, a smell or a sight or somebody's words. You can do the exact same thing in your story. You can use an experience like this to bridge together the present and the past and to segue between them. I find dialogue is an easy way to do this, as you can essentially just split the timeline mid-conversation, start it in the present and then move to what was the past. Someone says there's a car coming in the present timeline, and then there's a line break, and then we go into a conversation or a memory from the past, but picking up when they heard this before. So, or something similar before. That can work just fine, and then obviously you need to add in the context the reader needs to know that it's in the past. It's less direct to do this with smells and sights and that kind of thing, but the concept's still the same. Lean into the character experiencing the thing in the present, and then leave a break and show it again in the past. Something else that's really useful for flashbacks is using tenses correctly, which can be really fiddly at times. Going back in time is much easier to do if you're writing in the present tense for most of your story, for example, because you can just write a flashback or an earlier time in past tense, and it has that inbuilt separation and distance that indicates that this is from a different time period, so you don't need to work quite as hard to establish that. However, if you're writing in the past tense already and you want to go further into the past tense, that's when it can be difficult, and that's when the past perfect tense comes in. I've put a link in the description below that gives a bit more detail on that. Essentially, past tense, as we all know, would be I walked, and the past perfect tense would then be I had walked. As you can probably feel, there's a slight distance in the narrative perspective there. There's a little bit of separation, so pulling into past perfect to introduce your flashback or your old time period can be the way to go. Doing that for the first sentence or few sentences of the new time period can just alert the reader that something's changed. It's hard to maintain the past perfect tense for extended periods and it gets a bit unwieldy, but as I said, you can just use it as a transition to establish that you're talking about further in the past than you usually are, and once that's established, you can often then just revert back to normal past tense again for the rest of the flashback. Then obviously when you get back to the normal past timeline, you just make it clear with a reference to something from that time, so it's clear that you're back. It's a complicated thing to write, so experimenting is absolutely the way to go here. Check out that video for some examples. I don't know how good they are, and there's a link there for the past perfect tense as well, which hopefully will be helpful. Definitely something I'll do a full video on at some point, but hopefully this will do for now. Great question though. Thank you very much for your support as always.